Okay, so you send in all these articles about this East Coast port worker strike, and I gotta say, one thing immediately caught my eye. Photos, empty store shelves, panicked shoppers. It's like a flashback to March 2020 all over again, right?
Right.
But here's the thing. This time it's not hand sanitizer we're freaking out about, it's toilet paper. Seriously, toilet paper. The internet is convinced we're about to have another shortage. Toilet paper hoarding 2.0, as I saw it on X.
Yeah, I saw that too.
So before we all run out and buy up all the two-ply, we need to dive into what's actually going on with this strike and what it really means for all of us.
Okay.
So joining us today to help make sense of it all is our expert. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
To start us off, can you give us the rundown on the strike? How many workers are we talking? What's the potential for things to get really chaotic?
Yeah, so we're looking at 45,000 workers across 36 different ports on the East Coast.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a significant chunk of the shipping industry. So the possibility of things getting messy is definitely there.
Okay, so disruption is almost guaranteed at this point. But then you see those photos online of empty shelves, and it's easy to jump to the worst case scenario, which in this case seems to be a massive toilet paper shortage. But is that a rational fear?
Well, it makes sense why people would immediately think of that,
Uh-huh.
especially with everything that happened during the pandemic. But here's the thing. The toilet paper supply chain is not as fragile as some people might think.
Really? How so?
Well, for starters, more than 90% of the toilet paper used in the U.S. is actually made right here in the U.S. We're talking factories across the country, not giant cargo ships full of toilet paper sailing across the ocean.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess I never really thought about where my toilet paper comes from.
And the good news is, most of that toilet paper is transported by land trucks and trains. So even if every single cargo ship decided to take a break, your bathroom is probably going to be just fine.
Okay. That's a relief. Honestly, I might have even tossed an extra pack in my cart the last time I was at the store after seeing all those headlines.
Yeah, it's understandable.
Well, if you said 90% is domestic, so that means 10% still comes from somewhere else, right? What about those imports?
Good question. So most of those imports are coming from Canada and Mexico.
Okay.
And again, we're mostly talking trucks and trains here, not ships.
Yeah.
So those East Coast ports aren't really a factor. And actually, the American Forest and Paper Association, the folks who represent the paper industry, they're more worried about how the strike is going to impact their exports, not their imports.
So, wait, are you saying that instead of a toilet paper shortage, we might actually end up with a surplus? That's kind of funny when you think about it.
Well, human behavior can be pretty unpredictable, especially when it comes to something like this.
Yeah.
But yeah, logistically speaking, a toilet paper surplus is definitely possible.
Wild. All right, so if we can all agree to calm down about the toilet paper, what should we actually be paying attention to? 45,000 workers on strike means something is going to be harder to come by, right? What's the real story here?
You're right. A disruption of this size is going to have consequences. And you know how you can store toilet paper for months, maybe even years?
Yeah.
Well, there's some things that just can't wait that long.
Perishables. You're talking about perishables.
Exactly. And there's one in particular that comes to mind. Bananas.
The bananas.
Yeah.
Now that I was not expecting.
Yeah. Bananas. Think about it. Almost all the bananas we eat here in the U.S. are imported.
Wow. You're right. I never really thought about it, but I guess I just assumed they were grown here.
And that's where this strike could have a big impact. More than half of those imported bananas come through the ports that are affected by the strike.
Seriously?
And to make things even more interesting, a huge chunk of those banana imports comes through just one port, Wilmington, Delaware. So if this strike goes on for a while, yeah, you might have to switch up your breakfast routine.
Wow. So we could be looking at a banana shortage all because of this strike. It's interesting, right? We see one photo of an empty shelf and suddenly everyone thinks it's the end of the world, stocking up on toilet paper like it's 2020 again. But the real story, the one that could actually affect what we can and can't buy, is happening a lot more quietly. No dramatic photos of empty produce sections yet, at least.
It really shows how our perception of scarcity, which is often driven by what we see on social media and in the news, can be so different from what's actually happening.
And speaking of perception versus reality, one of the articles you sent me mentioned a woman named Shana Turbovsky from Fort Worth.
Right.
She said that as soon as she heard about this strike, she went out and bought a ton of stuff. Meat, rice, beans, you name it. And yes, even some toilet paper just in case.
Of course.
But what really stood out to me, and you pointed this out too, was that she admitted to feeling a bit of what she called pandemic PTSD. Remember those empty shelves from a few years ago?
Yeah, a lot of us still haven't forgotten that.
She said she'd rather be overprepared than caught off guard again, which I totally get. But what's interesting is that this need to stock up to feel in control, led her to buy a bunch of stuff that isn't even likely to be affected. Remember, the bananas are the real wild card here, not so much the canned goods.
It's a great example of how much the pandemic really messed with our heads, especially when it comes to this idea of scarcity. Even the thought of a potential shortage, whether it's real or not, can trigger this almost instinctive need to hoard stuff.
Right. It's like our brains are wired to focus on the most alarming information, even if it's not the most accurate? Better safe than sorry. That's probably what kept our ancestors alive back in the day.
Absolutely. You hear a noise in the bushes and you don't stop to think about all the harmless possibilities. Your brain goes straight to danger. It's a survival instinct. And while that kind of response might have been helpful hundreds of thousands of years ago, it's not always so helpful now,
Yeah.
especially with how much information is constantly being thrown at us these days.
So how do we get past that? How do we become more critical thinkers,
hmm
especially when we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides? How do we stop ourselves from making those fear-based purchases like we're seeing with this whole toilet paper thing?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah,
And to be honest, I don't think there's one easy answer.
right.
But I think the first step is just being aware of it, you know? Recognizing that our brains are kind of hardwired to focus on those potential threats, even when they might not be that serious.
So it's like we have to train ourselves to stop and think before we react, which honestly is easier said than done when you've got all those crazy headlines popping up on your phone and your friends are freaking out in the group chat about running out of toilet paper.
Exactly. It takes effort. But one thing that can help is to make sure you're getting your information from a variety of sources. It's
Oh.
so easy to get stuck in that echo chamber, especially on social media, where the algorithms are basically designed to show you more of what you already believe, even if what you believe isn't totally accurate.
Yeah, it's like that saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right, exactly.
Right.
We need to have a more nuanced understanding of the information that's coming at us. So instead of just scrolling through your usual social media feeds, look for information from sources that are known for being accurate and unbiased.
Hmm.
Real journalism.
And maybe take anything you see on social media with a grain of salt, especially if it makes you feel like you need to go out and buy everything in sight.
Definitely. A little bit of healthy skepticism is a good thing.
So to bring it back to this whole banana situation, if this strike does end up dragging on, what's the likely outcome? Are we talking
Yeah.
about empty shelves and crazy price hikes, or just a few minor inconveniences?
Predicting the future is always tricky, especially with something as complicated as global supply chains.
Yeah, for sure.
But if we look at what happened a few years ago, with all that port congestion,
Right.
that caused some pretty significant disruptions. So in the short term, it's likely that we'll see some delays and backlogs as companies try to reroute shipments away from the East Coast ports. Think of it like rush hour traffic. Everything slows down when you've got more cars than lanes.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about in the long term? What should people be prepared for?
Well, businesses don't like to lose money. So it's pretty likely that those higher transportation costs are going to get passed on to consumers eventually in the form of higher prices. So that morning cup of coffee might cost a little bit more, or that new phone you've been wanting might be a bit pricier. But, and I want to be very clear about this, we are not talking about widespread shortages like what we saw during the pandemic.
Okay, so no need to go full doomsday prepper just yet.
Mm,
But maybe it's a good reminder to be a little more aware of where our stuff comes from and how fragile those supply chains can be.
definitely. Little knowledge can go a long way, especially when it comes to making smart choices as consumers and as just people living in the world.
Couldn't agree more. Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the great toilet paper scare of 2024 to the very real psychology of scarcity and the importance of thinking critically in this age of information overload. Hopefully, you're leaving today with a better understanding of what's really going on with this port worker strike and how to deal with those moments when the world feels like it's falling apart.
It can be a lot to process for sure.
And as always, we want to leave you with something to think about. Maybe spark a conversation with your friends or family. So here's our final thought for you. How can we be more mindful consumers? How do we balance the need to be prepared for the unexpected with the need to not freak out and buy up everything in sight? It's a tough question, but an important one. And that's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, don't let those empty shelves or the internet scare you. We'll see you next time.